I need to tell you something that's been weighing on my heart for years now, and honestly, I'm not even sure where to begin, because this story is so twisted and complicated that sometimes I still can't believe it actually happened to me. But here goes nothing, because if sharing my experience helps even one person out there feel less alone, then it's worth reliving every painful moment. My parents forced me to live as their deceased daughter for 17 years, and when I finally escaped and started living as my true self, my mother showed up begging for the son she had abandoned. That's the short version, but the real story is so much deeper and more heartbreaking than those few sentences could ever capture. It all started when I was about 4 years old, and I remember noticing something strange happening around me, though at that age I didn't have the words or understanding to question it. They started calling me Emma instead of Ethan, and I remember feeling confused because I knew my name was Ethan, or at least I thought it was. My parents would gently correct me whenever I introduced myself as Ethan, saying things like, "Sweetie, your name is Emma," with these forced smiles that I can still see so clearly in my mind. Looking back now, I realize those smiles never quite reached their eyes, and there was always this desperate sadness lurking just beneath the surface. They started dressing me in dresses and skirts and all these frilly pink clothes that felt wrong against my skin. But I was just a child, and children trust their parents implicitly, don't they? I thought maybe this was just how things were supposed to be, that maybe all kids went through this weird phase where their parents dressed them funny and called them different names. Since I didn't have any siblings to compare my experience to, I genuinely believed this was normal family behavior. I played along because that's what good children do, right? They make their parents happy. I let them grow my hair long, even though I hated how it felt hanging down my back and getting in my face when I tried to run and play. I corrected anyone who used he or him pronouns, because that's what my parents had taught me to do, even though something deep in my gut told me it was wrong. My parents decorated my bedroom with posters of boy bands and filled my toy box with baby dolls and tea sets when all I really wanted was action figures and toy cars. It was around this time, probably when I was 5 or 6 years old, that I learned the most painful lesson of my childhood, and it's a lesson that would shape the next decade of my life in the most devastating way. I learned that making my parents happy, keeping them smiling, preventing them from crying or fighting, was infinitely more important than whatever I wanted or needed or felt inside. So when I desperately wanted to play football with the boys in the neighborhood, when I wanted to climb trees and get dirty and roughhouse the way boys do, I swallowed those desires down deep inside, where no one could see them. I figured that eventually, maybe with enough time and effort, those feelings would just disappear completely, that I could somehow extract them from my body like pulling out a splinter. I genuinely believed that one day I would wake up and feel comfortable in dresses, that I would start liking the things girls were supposed to like, and that my dream of being the daughter my parents so desperately wanted would finally come true. I convinced myself that if I just tried hard enough, I could become Emma and everyone would be happy. When I started elementary school, things got even more complicated because now my lie, or rather my parents' lie, had to extend beyond our home into the real world. I used the girls' bathrooms, even though everything inside me screamed that it was wrong. I remember the first time I had to use the girls' room at school, and I stood outside the door for what felt like forever, feeling like I was about to commit some terrible crime by walking through that doorway. Even now, decades later, I can still feel that crushing anxiety in my chest. I tried to join the boys' soccer team during recess, and the teacher told me girls couldn't play with the boys, that I needed to go play with the other girls on the playground. I can still remember how that felt, like a punch to the stomach, like the whole world was conspiring to keep me from being who I really was. My teachers would sometimes ask questions, especially when I got into fights with boys at recess or when I refused to participate in the dress-up corner during free time. They would pull my parents aside during parent-teacher conferences, and I would wait anxiously in the hallway, terrified of what was being said behind those closed doors. But my parents always had an explanation ready, always had some story about how I was just a tomboy, how I'd grow out of it, how they were monitoring the situation with a child psychologist. Looking back, I realize how many lies they told to keep their fantasy alive, how many people they manipulated into believing that everything was fine, that their daughter was just going through a phase. I learned to hide myself in so many ways during those early years. I hid my naturally deep voice by speaking in a higher pitch that made my throat hurt by the end of each day. I hid my interest in sports and cars and all the things boys were supposed to like, pretending instead to care about the latest pop stars and fashion trends that the other girls obsessed over. I hid the tears that came whenever I looked at myself in the mirror wearing a dress, whenever I saw my reflection with long hair and pink ribbons and everything that felt so fundamentally wrong. The more I suppressed my true self, the more my parents seemed to love me, and that's a really messed up thing to learn as a child. I remember thinking that love was conditional, that I would only be worthy of affection if I could successfully pretend to be someone I wasn't. There were these brief moments, though, these little glimpses of happiness that I clung to like a drowning person clings to driftwood. Every day I would wake up to my mother bringing me breakfast in bed, these elaborate spreads with fresh fruit arranged in smiley faces and heart-shaped pancakes drizzled with syrup. She would bring me surprise gifts almost daily, little toys and clothes and books that I had circled in the catalog, things that Emma was supposed to want even though Ethan inside me couldn't have cared less about them. My parents treated me like I was made of gold, like I was the most precious thing in their entire world, and for a child desperate for love and approval, that kind of attention was intoxicating. I told myself that this was what happiness felt like, that this was worth the sacrifice of my true identity. But then everything changed when I turned 13 years old, and I'm not being dramatic when I say that this moment altered the entire trajectory of my life. I woke up one morning with the worst pain in my abdomen, and when I went to the bathroom, I saw blood and absolutely panicked. I had no idea what was happening to my body because nobody, not my parents, not my teachers, not anyone, had ever explained male puberty to me. In my mind, I was dying. I genuinely thought I was dying. I ran to my dad's room, tears streaming down my face, completely convinced that I needed to go to the hospital immediately. My dad's face went completely pale, like all the blood had drained from his body in an instant. I threw myself at him seeking comfort, seeking reassurance that everything would be okay. But instead of hugging me, instead of comforting his terrified child, he literally pushed me away. The force of that rejection, both physical and emotional, nearly knocked me off my feet. He started shaking, his hands trembling as he backed away from me like I was contagious with some terrible disease. Then my mom burst into the room, probably wondering what all the commotion was about, and I watched my dad turn to her with this look of absolute horror on his face and say words that I will never forget as long as I live. "Sarah, what the hell is happening? Emma just got her first wet dream," he said, and in that moment, even in my confused and terrified state, I knew something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with my entire life. My mom's face crumpled, and she started sobbing these awful, gut-wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. She curled up on the floor in a ball, rocking back and forth, and all I could do was stand there frozen, still bleeding, still terrified, watching my mother have a complete mental breakdown while my father struggled to comfort her instead of me. That's when my dad grabbed my arm, not gently but with this firm, almost desperate grip, and dragged me into the spare bedroom that we rarely used. He locked the door behind us, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, something raw and painful and honest. "Ethan," he said, and hearing my real name for the first time in nearly a decade felt like being slapped across the face. "I need to tell you something, and you need to listen very carefully. You might have noticed by now that you aren't exactly a girl." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact yet so heavy with meaning, made my whole body go numb. I nodded slowly, relief washing over me because finally someone was acknowledging the truth that I had known deep in my bones for years. And that's when he told me everything, when all the puzzle pieces of my strange, uncomfortable childhood finally clicked into place, forming a picture that was even more disturbing than I could have imagined. Turns out I did have a sibling, a sister named Emma, who my parents had been desperately excited to raise. They had planned her entire life before she was even born, had decorated a nursery in soft pinks and lavenders, had chosen her name carefully because it meant whole or universal, had dreamed about all the milestones they would celebrate with their baby girl. But there were complications during the birth, terrible complications that my dad's voice broke when he tried to explain, and my mom had a stillbirth at 7 months pregnant. My father tried to convince my mother to take time to grieve properly, to see a therapist, to process the trauma of losing a child before trying again, but she refused to acknowledge her pain. She pushed him to get her pregnant again almost immediately, as if a new baby could somehow erase the loss of the first one. When they found out I was a boy, all of that suppressed grief came flooding back with a vengeance, and my mom fell into a depression so deep that my dad feared she might hurt herself. The only way he could calm her down, the only way he could keep her from completely falling apart, was by agreeing to raise me as Emma instead of Ethan, to give her back the daughter she had lost, to let her live in a fantasy world where her baby girl had survived. As my dad explained all of this through tears, his voice cracking and breaking with the weight of years of deception, I felt something inside me shatter. My entire life had been built on the grief of a child I never knew existed, a sister I never got to meet, whose ghost I had been forced to embody for 13 years. I was a replacement, a substitute, a living memorial to someone else's tragedy, and the cruelty of that realization nearly broke me. But at the same time, I felt this massive wave of relief wash over me, because at least now I knew the truth. At least now the lies were finally out in the open, and we could start fixing this mess, right? At least now I could start living as Ethan, as the person I actually was, and we could all move forward as a family who had finally acknowledged the truth. But then my dad took my silver lining and completely destroyed it with his next words. "Son," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder in what was probably meant to be a comforting gesture, but felt more like a weight pressing me down. "I need you to keep being Emma for a while longer, just until you're old enough to move out and live on your own. Think of it as a favor to your mother, as a way of protecting her from more pain." A favor? The word exploded out of my mouth before I could stop it. A favor? I've been living my entire life hating who I am, hiding who I really am, suffocating under the weight of someone else's identity, all because of you two, because you couldn't deal with your grief in a healthy way, because you used me as a band-aid for a wound that needed real healing. My dad's eyes filled with sorrow, and I could see that he knew what he was asking was wrong, that he understood the weight of what they had done to me. But he was still more committed to protecting my mother's feelings than to protecting his son's mental health and well-being. That's when I truly understood that nothing was going to change, that my parents would continue to prioritize their own pain and their own needs over mine, that I was going to have to be the one to save myself because no one else was going to do it for me. I pushed past him and burst out of that room, done with hiding, done with pretending, done with being Emma when I was Ethan, and that's when I came face to face with my mother standing in the hallway. "Emma, are you okay?" she asked, reaching out to touch my face with her trembling hands. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" The concern in her voice might have seemed genuine to an outside observer, but I could hear the desperation underneath it, the plea for me to keep playing along with her delusion. "I'm not doing this anymore, Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "This isn't right. This isn't fair to me, and I can't keep suffering just so you don't have to face your grief. I'm sorry for your loss, I really am. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being Emma when I'm Ethan. And I need you to understand that your daughter died 13 years ago, and I'm not her. I've never been her, and I never will be her." The look on her face was like I had reached into her chest and ripped her heart out with my bare hands. She staggered backward as if I had physically struck her, her hand flying to her mouth as tears began streaming down her cheeks. But I couldn't let her pain stop me anymore, couldn't let her grief continue to dictate my entire existence, so I grabbed my backpack and left the house without looking back. I had been babysitting for neighbors for the past year, saving up money for a new bike or maybe a gaming console, but suddenly that money had a much more important purpose. I walked to the mall, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, and for the first time in my life, I bought exactly what I wanted to wear. I walked into the boys section and picked out jeans that fit properly, t-shirts that hung loose and comfortable on my frame, a hoodie that made me look like any other teenage boy. I bought boys' sneakers and a baseball cap, and when I looked at myself in the dressing room mirror wearing clothes that actually felt right, I barely recognized the person staring back at me, but in the best possible way. This was me, this was Ethan, and even though I knew the battle ahead was going to be brutal, in that moment I felt more like myself than I had in 13 years. I felt like I was finally breathing properly after spending my entire life with my lungs compressed. Unfortunately, keeping my purchases hidden from my mother proved to be impossible because she heard me come home, even though I tried to be silent, even though I tried to sneak up to my room without anyone noticing. She came out of her room and saw me carrying shopping bags from the men's department, and something in her face changed from sadness to rage in an instant. Before I could even react, before I could protect myself or run away, she grabbed the nearest pair of kitchen scissors from the counter and started shredding my new clothes with a ferocity that was absolutely terrifying to witness. "This is not who you are," she screamed, her voice shrill and broken as fabric fell in ribbons around us. "I will not allow this. I will not let you do this to me. You are Emma. You are my daughter, and I will not lose you again." The way she said it, the raw desperation in her voice, made me realize that in her mind she truly believed I was Emma, that she had somehow convinced herself that the past 13 years weren't a lie, that she had managed to resurrect her daughter through sheer force of will, and I was now trying to kill Emma all over again by insisting on being Ethan. This time I didn't feel sad or even angry, just scared, genuinely terrified because my mother's grip on reality seemed to be slipping and I didn't know what she might do next. Thankfully, my dad heard the commotion and came running into the room, and while he tried to calm my mother down, tried to pry the scissors from her hands and pull her away from the shredded remains of my clothes, I made a decision that probably saved my life. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. My vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall, but I managed to dial 911 because I genuinely didn't know what else to do, didn't know how else to make this stop, didn't know how to protect myself from parents who loved a dead child more than they loved their living son. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, 20 of the longest minutes of my entire life where I hid in my room with the door locked, while my mother alternated between sobbing and screaming downstairs. 2 officers came, a tall man with graying hair who looked like he'd seen everything, and a younger woman with kind eyes who reminded me of my middle school guidance counselor. They separated us to take statements, which I later learned is standard procedure in domestic disputes, and the female officer took me into the living room while the male officer stayed with my parents in the kitchen. I could hear my mother's voice carrying through the house, that same desperate, broken quality that made me feel guilty, even though I knew logically that I had nothing to feel guilty about. I told the female officer everything, absolutely everything, because at that point I had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to turn. I explained how I had been raised as Emma when I was actually Ethan, how I had only recently discovered the truth about my dead sister, how my mother had just destroyed my clothes when I tried to assert my real identity. The officer's expression shifted from professional neutrality to genuine concern as I spoke, and she kept taking notes in her little notepad while nodding encouragingly. She had these kind eyes that made me feel like someone was finally listening to me, like someone in a position of authority was taking my situation seriously. I felt this tiny spark of hope igniting in my chest, this fragile little flame that whispered, maybe this was it, maybe this was my escape, maybe someone would finally help me. But then I heard my mother's voice drifting in from the kitchen, and it was completely different from the screaming, hysterical voice I had heard earlier. She sounded calm now, measured and controlled, with just the right amount of maternal concern. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe she could flip a switch that quickly, and I crept closer to the doorway to hear what she was telling the male officer. She was explaining that I had been going through a difficult phase lately, that I had been acting out and rebelling against normal teenage boundaries, that I had been questioning my identity in concerning ways. The way she told it, she made it sound like I was the problem, like I was some troubled kid having a mental breakdown rather than a child who had been abused for his entire life. She claimed that cutting up my clothes was her way of preventing me from doing something I would regret, that she was just trying to protect me from making irreversible decisions during what was clearly an emotionally unstable time. She painted herself as the concerned, loving mother, just trying to help her confused daughter through a rough patch, and I could hear my father backing her up, adding details that made their story sound even more believable. They presented this perfect united front, this facade of worried parents dealing with a troubled teen, and I felt my hope crumbling into dust because I realized they were winning. They were convincing the police that I was the problem, not them. When the officers brought us all back together in the living room, I could see it in their eyes, especially in the male officer's eyes, that mixture of pity and skepticism that told me they had bought my parents' story. The male officer looked at me with what he probably thought was compassionate understanding and said something about how teenage years can be confusing, how identity questions are common at my age, how sometimes kids go through phases where they rebel against their parents. He recommended family counseling, suggested some therapists who specialize in adolescent issues, basically treated the situation like a typical parent-teen conflict rather than the systemic abuse and manipulation it actually was. My heart sank so far I thought it might fall right through the floor. They weren't going to help me. They weren't going to save me. They were going to leave me here with these people who had stolen my identity, who had erased my existence for 13 years, who loved a ghost more than they loved their living son. After the officers left, making my parents promise to look into counseling and checking to make sure I wasn't in any immediate danger, I was left alone with my parents again, and the silence that fell over the house was absolutely suffocating. My mother acted like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just manipulated the police, like she hadn't just destroyed my clothes in a fit of rage. She went right back to calling me Emma, went right back to pretending that the past few hours hadn't occurred. My father kept giving me these looks, these sad, apologetic glances that did absolutely nothing to help my situation. He knew what they were doing was wrong. I could see it written all over his face, but he was too weak to stand up to my mother, too committed to protecting her fragile mental state to protect his son. I felt more alone and trapped than I ever had before because I had tried to reach out for help, had tried to escape, and it had failed spectacularly, and now I had no idea what to do next. The next few days existed in this weird, tense limbo where everyone pretended to go about their normal routines while the truth of our situation hung in the air like poison gas. I started researching online, spending hours after my parents went to bed reading about gender identity, parental abuse, legal rights of minors, anything that might help me understand my situation and figure out a way forward. I found forums and support groups where people shared stories similar to mine. Not exactly the same because my situation was pretty uniquely messed up, but close enough that I didn't feel completely alone. One person on a forum suggested documenting everything, creating a paper trail of evidence that could be used later if needed. So I started keeping a journal hidden under my mattress where I wrote down every conversation, every incident, every little thing that happened. I also started saving money again, taking on more babysitting jobs around the neighborhood, doing yard work for elderly neighbors, even selling some of my old toys and video games online. I hid the cash in different spots around my room, behind loose baseboards, inside old books, taped to the back of my dresser drawers, anywhere my mother wouldn't think to look during her frequent room inspections. I wasn't sure what my plan was yet, didn't know exactly how I was going to escape or where I would go, but I knew that having money would give me options, would give me possibilities, would give me a chance at freedom. About a week after the police incident, my mother announced that she had scheduled an appointment with a therapist, and for approximately 5 seconds I felt hopeful, before she added that it was Dr. Martinez, an old friend of hers from college who specialized in adolescent psychology. Of course she would choose someone she knew, someone she could influence, someone who would take her side over mine. I knew before we even walked into that first appointment that it was going to be a waste of time, that it wasn't real therapy, it was just another way for my parents to maintain control over the narrative. The first session was exactly what I expected, exactly as useless as I had feared. My mother sat right next to me the entire time, her hand resting on my knee in what probably looked like a comforting gesture to Dr. Martinez, but felt like a warning to me. Every time I tried to tell the truth, every time I opened my mouth to explain what had really been happening, my mother would squeeze my knee harder, a silent reminder of what would happen if I spoke out. Dr. Martinez kept referring to me as Emma, kept talking about confusion and identity disorders and typical teenage rebellion, kept acting like this was just a phase I was going through rather than a fundamental truth about who I was. I just nodded along, gave the answers I knew Dr. Martinez wanted to hear, played the role of the confused teenager who needed guidance, because I had learned that sometimes silence and compliance were the best forms of self-preservation. After we left his office, my mother seemed pleased with how the session had gone, satisfied that she had found another ally in her quest to keep me as Emma. I didn't respond to her comments, had learned that silence was often my best defense, that engaging with her delusions only made things worse. That night I added a detailed entry to my journal about the therapy session, documenting every leading question Dr. Martinez had asked, every time my mother had squeezed my knee to keep me quiet, every manipulation tactic that had been used to maintain their false narrative. My journal was getting pretty thick with entries by this point, filled with documentation of years of abuse and manipulation, and I hid it in a new spot every few days, because I was paranoid about my mother finding it during one of her cleaning sessions, which were really just excuses to snoop through my belongings and make sure I wasn't hiding anything that contradicted her fantasy. The following day at school, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I needed to talk to someone outside my home, someone who might actually have the power to help me, so I waited until lunch period and walked to the guidance counselor's office. Mr. Thompson had always seemed understanding and approachable, had helped me through some tough times when I was struggling with math last year, and I hoped that maybe he would listen to me now. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and when he called out for me to come in, I almost lost my nerve and ran away. I took a deep breath, walked into his office, and sat down in the chair across from his desk. "Mr. Thompson," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I need to talk to you about something serious, something that's been going on at home for a really long time." He put down the papers he had been reading and gave me his full attention, his expression shifting to one of concern. I explained that I was actually born male, that my parents had been raising me as a girl for 13 years, that I wanted to be recognized as Ethan instead of Emma. I didn't go into all the gruesome details, didn't tell him about my dead sister or my mother's mental breakdown or the destroyed clothes, but I gave him enough information to understand that this was a serious situation that needed intervention. Mr. Thompson's expression changed from surprise to concern to something that looked like determination. He asked me a few clarifying questions, clearly trying to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, then told me that he would need to contact my parents and possibly Child Protective Services because what I was describing sounded like potential abuse. My stomach immediately dropped, that tiny flame of hope I had been nursing flickering and threatening to go out completely. I begged him not to call my parents yet, explaining what had happened with the police, how my mother had manipulated them into believing I was just a confused teenager having a phase. He looked conflicted, but eventually agreed to hold off for one day while he consulted with the school administration and figured out the best way to proceed. I left his office feeling that familiar mixture of hope and dread that had become my constant companion, wondering if this would be the moment someone finally helped me, or if it would be just another dead end, just another adult who ultimately sided with my parents over me. I got my answer the next morning when my mother burst into my room before school, her face red with fury, her eyes blazing with an anger I hadn't seen since the scissors incident. "What did you tell that guidance counselor?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Apparently, Mr. Thompson had called despite his promise to wait, had spoken to my mother about my allegations, and she had already done damage control. She told me she had already talked to the principal, had already explained that I was going through a difficult time, had already mentioned Dr. Martinez as evidence that we were addressing my issues appropriately. She informed me that I wasn't going back to that school, that she had already called in to say I was sick, that we would be looking at other educational options like homeschooling or online school, where she could better monitor my influences and protect me from people who might encourage my delusions. Just like that, with one phone call, I lost my daily escape from home, lost my friends, lost my one potential ally in Mr. Thompson, lost any chance of someone at school noticing what was really happening and stepping in to help. My mother also confiscated my phone that day, claiming I needed to focus on getting better rather than being influenced by whatever I had been reading online. I was completely cut off from the outside world, completely isolated, completely trapped with no way to reach out for help or communicate with anyone who might understand what I was going through. For the next few weeks, I was basically under house arrest, and I don't use that term lightly because it truly felt like being imprisoned in my own home. My mother started working from home specifically to keep an eye on me, setting up her laptop in the dining room where she could watch me at all times. My father still went to his office during the day, but he called multiple times every day to check in, to make sure I was still there, to verify with my mother that I hadn't tried to escape or act out. I was never left alone for more than a few minutes, never given any privacy, never allowed any freedom or autonomy over my own life. During this time, my mother went through my room with the thoroughness of a detective searching for evidence. She found most of my hidden cash, those months of babysitting money that represented my hope for escape, and confiscated it for my own protection, as she put it. Thankfully, she missed one hiding spot, a bundle of bills I had taped to the underside of my desk drawer in a moment of paranoid caution that ended up saving my life. She also didn't find my journal, which I had started hiding inside an old teddy bear with a broken seam in its back, carefully tucking my documentation inside the stuffing where no one would think to look. My mother went through my closet with ruthless efficiency, removing anything that could be considered even remotely neutral or masculine. She took away my comfortable jeans and replaced them with skinny jeans that felt restrictive and feminine. She removed my loose t-shirts and replaced them with fitted tops and blouses that made me uncomfortable. She got rid of my sneakers and gave me ballet flats and sandals. By the time she was done, I was left with the most stereotypically feminine wardrobe possible, clothes that made me feel like I was wearing a costume every single day, like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The isolation was destroying me slowly from the inside out. I needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who wouldn't judge me or try to convince me I was confused. I remembered my friend Marcus from biology class. Not my best friend, but someone who had always been kind to me, and more importantly, he had mentioned during a class discussion about diversity that his uncle was transgender. Maybe he would understand. Maybe his family would be sympathetic to my situation. Maybe they could help where everyone else had failed. One afternoon, when my mother was on a particularly long conference call in her office, I snuck into my father's study and used his computer to access social media. I found Marcus on Facebook and sent him a direct message explaining my situation as briefly and clearly as possible, telling him I was actually a boy being forced to live as a girl, telling him I needed help escaping. I asked if we could meet somehow, if his family might be willing to intervene, anything that might give me a chance at freedom. Then I carefully deleted the message from the sent folder, cleared the browser history, and snuck back to my room before my mother's call ended, my heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. 3 days later, on a random Tuesday afternoon, I was shocked when there was a knock at our front door, and it turned out to be Marcus. He had told his mom about my message, and she had helped him come up with a plan to check on me. He told my mother he was dropping off homework assignments from school, acting casual and friendly like this was a completely normal, innocent visit. My mother seemed suspicious. I could see it in the way her eyes narrowed and how she hovered near us, but she couldn't really refuse to let him in without seeming unreasonable. Marcus handed me a folder full of papers that were supposedly homework, but were actually just random worksheets he had printed out, then asked if he could use our bathroom. On his way back from the bathroom, he managed to slip me a note hidden between the homework sheets, his hand moving so quickly and smoothly that my mother didn't even notice the exchange. After he left and my mother went back to her work, I locked myself in my bathroom to read the note, my hands trembling as I unfolded the small piece of paper. Marcus believed me, the note said in his messy handwriting. His family believed me. His parents were willing to help if I needed a place to stay, if I needed support, if I needed anything at all. He included his cell phone number and told me to call from a safe phone anytime, day or night, and they would come get me. I felt tears streaming down my face as I read those words, felt that hope igniting again in my chest, stronger this time, more determined. I wasn't completely alone. Someone believed me. Someone was willing to help. I just needed to figure out how to get out of this house and to safety. My opportunity came sooner than I expected, arrived in the form of a family emergency that my parents couldn't ignore. My father's father had a heart attack and was hospitalized in critical condition 3 states away. My parents needed to travel to see him, needed to be with family during this crisis, and they debated for hours about what to do with me because they clearly didn't trust me to stay home alone. Finally, they decided I would stay with our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who had known me as Emma for years and who my mother trusted completely. Mrs. Patterson was a sweet woman, kind and gentle, but she was also in her 70s and took medication every night that knocked her out completely. The first night I stayed at her house, I waited in the guest room until I heard her soft snoring through the wall. Then I carefully snuck out through the back door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest as I walked quickly through the dark streets to the gas station about half a mile away. I used the payphone there, one of the last remaining payphones in town, and called the number Marcus had given me with shaking fingers. His father answered on the second ring, his voice warm and reassuring, even though I was essentially a stranger calling his house at 10 o'clock at night. He told me to stay where I was, that he would come get me right away, and true to his word, he pulled up to the gas station in his minivan about 15 minutes later. He didn't ask invasive questions during the drive, didn't make me explain or justify my decision to run away, just drove me to their house where Marcus was waiting on the front porch with his mom. Marcus's mom, whose name was Jennifer, hugged me immediately, which felt strange and uncomfortable because I wasn't used to physical affection, but also really nice in a way I couldn't quite explain. She said they had made up the guest room for me, that I was safe now, that we would figure everything out together. I hadn't been hugged like that, with genuine warmth and acceptance, in longer than I could remember, and I found myself crying into her shoulder, all the fear and stress and loneliness of the past months pouring out in great heaving sobs that I couldn't control. That night I stayed at Marcus's house, sleeping in their guest room that was decorated in neutral colors, rather than the aggressive femininity of my room at home. Jennifer lent me some of Marcus's old clothes to sleep in, clothes that actually felt comfortable and right against my skin for the first time in 13 years. I slept better that night than I had in months, maybe years, finally feeling safe enough to let my guard down and actually rest. The next morning, reality came crashing back when I woke up to the sound of voices in the kitchen below. My parents would be checking in with Mrs. Patterson soon. They would discover I was gone. The nightmare wasn't over yet. It was really just beginning. Marcus's parents, Jennifer and Robert, sat down with me at their kitchen table over breakfast. Robert was a social worker, which I hadn't known until that morning, and he explained that what my parents had been doing was a form of emotional and psychological abuse. He said I had options, including filing for emancipation, which would legally separate me from my parents and give me control over my own life. It sounded too good to be true, and my years of disappointment had taught me not to get my hopes up too high, but I couldn't help feeling that small spark of possibility. Jennifer made me hot chocolate with marshmallows while Robert explained the legal process, and I realized these were the kind of parents people were supposed to have, parents who listened and protected and actually put their child's well-being first. We spent that morning discussing next steps, making plans, figuring out how to navigate the complex legal and social services systems. Robert called a colleague who worked specifically with LGBTQ youth, someone who could provide resources and guidance. His colleague recommended an organization called Hope Harbor that provided support and resources for teens in crisis, including teens dealing with gender identity issues and abusive home situations. Before we could make any concrete decisions about where to go from here, my phone rang. Well, not my phone since my mother had confiscated that, but the house phone that Mrs. Patterson had given me for emergencies. It was Mrs. Patterson herself, her voice high and panicky, saying that my parents had called to check on me and she couldn't find me anywhere. I could hear the worry in her voice and felt guilty for scaring her, so I told her I had gone for an early morning walk to clear my head and would be back soon. I hung up and looked at Robert, who had been listening to the conversation, and he nodded seriously. "We need to do this right," he said. "We're going to take you back so you can get your things and properly explain to Mrs. Patterson what's happening, and we're going to make sure everything is documented and legal, so your parents can't claim we kidnapped you." When we arrived back at Mrs. Patterson's house, there was a police car in the driveway, and my heart sank straight down to my feet. Mrs. Patterson had called the police to report me missing, had panicked when she couldn't find me even after my phone call because she was responsible for me, and what if something had happened? The officer was taking notes as Mrs. Patterson spoke rapidly, gesturing with her hands, her face creased with worry. Robert handled the situation with the calm professionalism of someone who had dealt with these kinds of situations many times before. He introduced himself as a licensed social worker, showed the officer his credentials, and explained that I had reached out to his family for help due to an abusive and harmful home situation. He described how my parents had been forcing me to live as a gender that wasn't mine, how they had isolated me and controlled every aspect of my life, how this constituted emotional abuse even if there was no physical violence. The officer, a middle-aged man named Officer Chen, seemed skeptical at first, probably having heard many dramatic teenage complaints that turned out to be exaggerated, but Robert's professional credentials and calm demeanor made him take the situation seriously. Officer Chen called his supervisor and consulted with a youth services liaison, spent about 45 minutes making calls and taking statements from both me and Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that my parents had been extremely controlling and that she had noticed concerning behaviors, even though she hadn't known the full story. After what felt like an eternity of waiting and worrying, Officer Chen finally agreed to let me leave with Marcus's family temporarily, while the situation was investigated properly through the correct channels. He helped me gather my things from Mrs. Patterson's house, gave her his card so she could call if she had any concerns, and assured her that she had done nothing wrong. As we were loading my few belongings into Robert's car, my phone rang again. My mother. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Officer Chen nodded at me encouragingly, indicating I should answer, so I took a deep breath and pressed the answer button with trembling fingers. My mother's voice was like ice, cold and sharp and dangerous, demanding to know where I was and why I had left Mrs. Patterson's house. I took another deep breath, drawing on reserves of courage I didn't know I possessed, and told her that I was safe but I wasn't coming home. I was getting help from people who accepted me as Ethan, not Emma. People who saw me for who I really was, rather than who they wanted me to be. There was silence on the other end of the line for several long seconds, a silence that felt heavy and ominous, like the calm before a storm. Then my mother's voice turned from ice to steel, hard and unyielding and absolutely furious. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed. "We're coming home immediately. This little rebellion ends now. Do you understand me? You are my daughter. You are Emma, and you will come home and you will stop this nonsense." I hung up on her, which I had never done before in my entire life, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. Robert put his arm around my shoulders in a fatherly gesture that made my throat tight with emotion and led me to the car. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said simply. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, paperwork, and conversations with people whose job was to help kids like me. I spoke with a counselor at Hope Harbor who specialized in transgender youth and who explained that what my parents had done was essentially a form of forced gender identity, which was recognized as a type of abuse in psychological literature. She was patient and kind and explained things in ways that made sense, helped me understand that my feelings were valid, that I wasn't confused or going through a phase, that I was actually dealing with the aftermath of 13 years of being forced to suppress my true identity. She also connected me with a lawyer named Ms. Rodriguez, who specialized in family law and minors' rights. Ms. Rodriguez explained my legal options in detail, walking me through the process of seeking emancipation, what that would mean, what responsibilities I would have, what rights I would gain. She said my case was unusual, but that we had a solid foundation for legal action given the documented abuse and the fact that I had multiple witnesses and professionals supporting my claims. Meanwhile, my parents had returned home from visiting my grandfather and were absolutely losing their minds over my disappearance. They filed a missing persons report, claiming that Marcus's family had kidnapped me and manipulated me into running away. They called everyone they knew, spreading their version of the story to neighbors, friends, relatives, anyone who would listen. They painted me as mentally unstable, claimed I had been brainwashed by radical activists, said that Marcus's family were dangerous extremists trying to steal their child. The smear campaign was intense and vicious, and I learned later that they had been calling hospitals and police stations and even private investigators trying to find me and drag me back home. The police did come to Marcus's house to investigate the kidnapping allegations, which was terrifying even though we knew we had done everything correctly. Fortunately, Officer Chen was assigned to the case since he had been involved from the beginning, and he explained to his colleagues that this was clearly a case of a minor seeking safety from an abusive situation, not a kidnapping. He showed them the statements he had taken, the documentation from Robert about proper procedure, the evidence of my parents' controlling behavior. Still, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated, and it was clear I couldn't stay at Marcus's house forever. My parents knew where they lived, and I was genuinely worried they might try something desperate like showing up and causing a scene or trying to physically remove me from the house. The counselor at Hope Harbor suggested their emergency youth shelter, a safe house where I could stay while we worked through the legal process and figured out a more permanent solution. The shelter wasn't exactly comfortable, just a converted house with bunk beds and shared bathrooms and communal spaces, but it was safe, and that was what mattered most. There were other teenagers there too, kids with their own stories of abuse, rejection, homelessness, survival, and it was both heartbreaking and comforting to be around people who understood what it was like to lose your family. We had group therapy sessions every day where we could talk about our experiences and feelings in a supportive environment. My caseworker at the shelter, a woman named Dana who had warm brown eyes and a gentle manner, helped me file for emergency emancipation. She explained that it was a challenging process, that most judges prefer to keep families together whenever possible, but given the unique and extreme circumstances of my case, we had a reasonable chance of success. At the very least, filing the petition would buy us time to build a stronger case and protect me from being forced to return home against my will. About 10 days into my stay at the shelter, my parents found me. I was sitting in the common room working on some online coursework, since the shelter had arrangements for us to continue our education, when I heard my mother's voice at the front desk. My entire body went cold, every muscle tensing with fear and something like instinctive panic. I slipped out the back door and immediately texted Dana, who dropped everything and came to the shelter within 15 minutes. By the time I returned with Dana at my side, my parents were in the lobby arguing with the shelter director, my mother crying dramatically, while my father made threats about lawsuits and police involvement and parental rights. Dana stepped in with the calm authority of someone who had handled many similar situations, explaining that I was under the protection of Hope Harbor and that I had filed for emancipation, showing them the official paperwork to prove this wasn't just some teenage runaway situation but a legitimate legal process. My father's face turned red with barely contained rage, but my mother just looked defeated, her shoulders sagging as if all the fight had suddenly drained out of her. "Can we at least talk to our child?" my father asked, and I noticed he very carefully avoided using either Emma or Ethan, probably on advice from their lawyer. Dana looked at me questioningly, silently asking if I was willing to face them, if I felt safe enough to have this conversation. I nodded, even though every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to hide, to protect myself. But I knew I needed to face them eventually, needed to stand up for myself and make them understand that I was serious about this. We sat in one of the shelter's private meeting rooms, the four of us arranged around a small table, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. My mother couldn't look me in the eye, kept her gaze fixed on her hands folded in her lap, while my father did all the talking, his voice alternating between pleading and threatening depending on the moment. He promised things would be different if I came home, said they would consider letting me express myself more freely, claimed they would find a better therapist who wasn't one of my mother's friends, swore they would try to understand and accept me. But every promise came with conditions, with caveats, with subtle implications that I would still need to compromise who I was to make them comfortable. I just shook my head, feeling sad but also strangely calm and certain about my decision. "It's too late for promises," I told them, my voice steadier than I expected. "You didn't raise me. You raised a replacement for the daughter you lost. And I need to find out who I really am without you controlling and manipulating every aspect of my identity." My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, broken and fragile. "You'll always be Emma to me," she said. "I can't lose my daughter again. I just can't go through that pain again." And there it was, the truth laid bare and undeniable. Her words confirmed what I had known deep down all along but had been afraid to fully acknowledge. This wasn't about me, had never been about me, was always about her grief and her loss and her inability to accept reality. I stood up, feeling emotionally drained but somehow also stronger, more sure of myself than I had been in a long time. The meeting ended without any resolution, my parents leaving the shelter while I returned to the common room, and I sat on my bunk bed feeling exhausted, but also like I had just won some small but important victory. I had faced them and stood my ground and hadn't backed down, and that meant something. The next morning, I received official notice that there would be a hearing for my emancipation petition in 3 weeks, giving me just enough time to prepare, but not so much time that the uncertainty would drive me completely crazy. Dana helped me get ready for the hearing, gathering evidence and documentation, practicing what I would say to the judge, preparing me for the kinds of questions I might face. Marcus and his parents agreed to testify on my behalf, and even Mrs. Patterson, who had been confused by the whole situation but was ultimately concerned for my welfare, provided a written statement about my parents' controlling behavior and concerning parenting choices. As the hearing approached, my parents changed tactics in what was obviously a calculated move advised by their lawyer. They started sending messages through their attorney, offering various compromises and deals. They would let me see any therapist I wanted. They would allow me to explore my identity however I chose as long as I came home and lived with them. They would buy me whatever clothes I wanted and let me cut my hair however I liked. Every offer came with conditions that would still give them ultimate control over my life, still keep me trapped in their narrative, still allow them to frame my identity as something they were graciously permitting rather than something that was fundamentally mine. I declined every single offer, working closely with Ms. Rodriguez to craft responses that were polite but firm. I was done with half measures, done with conditional acceptance, done with compromises that would still leave me living someone else's life. 2 days before the hearing, I received an unexpected visit at the shelter. It was my father, alone this time, without my mother. He looked tired and older than I remembered, like he had aged several years in just a few weeks. Dana stayed with me as he sat down across from us in the meeting room, and I could see his hands trembling slightly as he folded them on the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "and a lot of reading about gender identity, about forced gender assignment, about what we did to you and how harmful it was." He paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I was wrong. We were wrong. What we did to you was abuse, pure and simple, and I'm so sorry, Ethan." Hearing him say my real name without any hesitation, without any qualification or apology in his voice, made tears spring to my eyes before I could stop them. But I remained cautious, my years of disappointment and manipulation making me wary of sudden changes of heart. "What about Mom?" I asked, needing to know if this was genuine or just another tactic. His expression darkened, pain and frustration flashing across his face. "Your mother isn't ready to accept this reality yet," he admitted. "She may never be ready, if I'm being completely honest. She's still grieving for Emma, still can't separate you from the daughter she lost. But I want you to know that I'm trying to understand, that I'm working on myself, and I want to make things right however I can, in whatever way you'll let me." I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to what seemed like genuine remorse and change. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, wanted to throw myself into his arms and have at least one parent back in my life. But another part remembered 13 years of lies and manipulation and abuse, remembered all the times he had chosen to protect my mother's delusions over protecting his son. "I need time," I told him finally, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I need you to understand that I need to be Ethan completely and fully, not just when it's convenient or when Mom isn't around, but all the time. I need you to accept that Emma died 13 years ago, and I am not her replacement." He nodded, understanding and acceptance clear in his eyes. "I'm going to get help, real help from a therapist who specializes in these issues," he said. "I'm going to work on understanding what we did wrong and why it was so harmful." He reached across the table like he wanted to take my hand but stopped himself, respecting my boundaries. "Whatever you decide about the emancipation, I'll support your decision, and I'll keep working on your mother, though I can't promise she'll ever come around." After he left, I sat with Dana for a long time trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out if this was genuine change or just another manipulation tactic, trying to decide if I could ever trust him again. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I expected, bringing with it a mixture of terror and hope that made my stomach churn. I wore clothes that Marcus had helped me pick out, simple jeans and a button-down shirt that felt masculine but not over the top, clothes that let me look like myself, whoever that was turning out to be. Both of my parents were there in the courtroom with their lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit. My mother still couldn't look directly at me, kept her gaze fixed on some point over my shoulder, but my father gave me a small nod of encouragement that I wasn't sure how to interpret. Marcus and his family sat behind me along with Dana and Ms. Rodriguez, and their presence gave me strength, reminded me that I had people on my side even if my own parents couldn't be those people. The judge was an older woman with intelligent eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she listened carefully and attentively as both sides presented their cases. My parents' lawyer argued that I was too young to make such life-altering decisions, that I needed parental guidance and stability, that my parents loved me and only wanted what was best for me even if their methods had been misguided. Ms. Rodriguez presented our evidence methodically and thoroughly, including documentation of the psychological harm I had suffered from being forced to live as someone I wasn't, statements from professionals who had evaluated me, testimony from people who had witnessed my parents' controlling behavior. When it was my turn to speak, when the judge asked if I wanted to address the court, I stood up on shaking legs and told my story as simply and honestly as I could. I explained that I didn't hate my parents, that I understood they were dealing with tremendous grief and loss, but that I couldn't continue living a lie for their benefit. I needed space and freedom to discover who I really was after 13 years of being forced to be someone else, someone who had never actually existed except in my parents' grief-stricken imaginations. The judge asked me thoughtful, probing questions about my plans for education, for housing, for financial support, clearly wanting to ensure I had thought through the practical realities of emancipation. Robert and Dana explained the transitional housing program Hope Harbor offered specifically for youth in situations like mine, where I could stay while finishing high school, where I would have support and supervision, but also autonomy and freedom. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, after asking more questions and reviewing documents, the judge called for a short recess to consider her decision. Those 20 minutes felt like the longest 20 minutes of my entire life. Longer even than waiting for the police to arrive that night, my mother destroyed my clothes. I sat in the hallway with Marcus, too nervous to speak, too anxious to sit still, pacing back and forth while he sat quietly offering silent support just by being there. When we returned to the courtroom and the judge delivered her ruling, I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation and fear. She granted me partial emancipation, which wasn't everything I had hoped for, but was more than I had dared to expect. I would be allowed to make my own decisions regarding my gender identity, my medical care, my living situation, and my education. My parents would still have certain legal and financial responsibilities until I turned 18, including providing health insurance and financial support, but they couldn't force me to live with them or control my identity anymore. It was a compromise, a middle ground, but it was enough. It was more than enough. It was freedom. I could live at the Hope Harbor Transitional Housing, attend a new school where nobody knew me as Emma, and begin the legal process of changing my name to match my true identity. As we left the courtroom, my father approached me cautiously, respecting my space. "I meant what I said before," he told me quietly. "I want to be part of your life, Ethan, whenever you're ready, however you're comfortable with." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without crying, knowing it would be a long road to forgiveness and trust, but feeling like maybe, just maybe, it was a road we could walk together eventually. My mother walked past without acknowledging me, without looking at me, her face a mask of grief that I finally understood would probably never fully heal. I hoped that someday she would realize she hadn't lost anyone, that she had gained a son who had been there all along waiting to be seen, but I also accepted that she might never reach that understanding. That night in my new room at the Hope Harbor housing, I sat down and wrote the longest entry yet in my journal, documenting everything that had happened that day, everything I was feeling, all my hopes and fears about the future. For the first time ever, I signed the entry with my real name, Ethan Michael Wilson, and it felt right, felt true, felt like coming home to myself after a very long journey through someone else's life. The weeks following the court hearing brought changes that were both exciting and terrifying in equal measure. I moved into the Hope Harbor Transitional Housing permanently, sharing a small 2-bedroom apartment with another teen named Jordan, who was also navigating identity issues and family rejection. Jordan was non-binary and had been kicked out by their religious parents 6 months earlier, and we bonded over late-night conversations about what it meant to discover yourself when everyone around you had already decided who you were supposed to be. Having a roommate who understood, who didn't judge, who saw me for who I really was, rather than who my parents had tried to make me, was healing in ways I hadn't expected. My caseworker Dana checked in with me twice a week initially, making sure I was adjusting okay to my new living situation, helping me navigate the various systems and bureaucracies that came with being a partially emancipated minor. She helped me enroll in a new high school across town, a larger school where nobody knew my history, where I could introduce myself as Ethan from day one without having to explain or justify or defend my identity. The process of legally changing my name turned out to be incredibly complicated, involving mountains of paperwork, multiple court appearances, fees I could barely afford even with my parents' mandated financial support, and what felt like endless waiting for various government agencies to process documents. But finally, after nearly 4 months of bureaucratic nonsense and frustrating delays, I officially became Ethan Michael Wilson instead of Emma Michelle Wilson. The judge who approved my name change, a different judge from the emancipation hearing, congratulated me and told me she hoped this was the beginning of a happier chapter in my life. I took the court order, got it officially certified, and framed it like it was a diploma or an award, hanging it on my bedroom wall as a daily reminder that I had fought for myself and won, that I had claimed my identity despite everyone who had tried to take it from me. Starting at a new school was nerve-wracking in ways I hadn't anticipated, because I had spent 13 years hiding who I was, and now I was suddenly expected to just be myself openly, On my first day, I wore jeans and a hoodie, nothing fancy or attention-grabbing, just normal teenage boy clothes that made me feel comfortable in my own skin. I introduced myself as Ethan in every class, and most of the other students just accepted it without question, without drama, without the invasive curiosity I had feared. Sure, there were a few kids who seemed confused or asked questions, but for the most part, people treated me like any other new student trying to find their place in an unfamiliar environment. I made friends slowly, cautiously, still wary after years of hiding my true self. There was a guy named Tyler in my English class who shared my love of science fiction novels, and we started eating lunch together, talking about books and movies and normal teenage stuff that had nothing to do with gender or identity or family trauma. There was a girl named Sierra in my art class who complimented my drawing skills and invited me to join the art club, where I discovered I actually had a decent talent for sketching and painting. These friendships felt different from any relationships I had before because they were based on who I actually was, rather than the persona I had been forced to maintain. My grades improved dramatically once I wasn't spending all my mental and emotional energy on maintaining a lie, on suppressing my true identity, on walking the tightrope of my parents' expectations. I actually enjoyed learning again, found myself getting genuinely interested in my classes, particularly biology and psychology, where we discussed topics that felt relevant to understanding my own experiences. My teachers were supportive once Dana had explained my situation to the school counseling office, and they used my correct name and pronouns without making a big deal about it, which was exactly what I needed. My father kept his word about staying in contact and working on himself. He started calling me every Sunday evening, conversations that were awkward and stilted at first, but gradually became more natural and comfortable. He told me about the therapy group he had joined for parents of transgender children, about the books he was reading to educate himself, about the difficult conversations he was having with my mother trying to help her understand. He never pressured me to come home or to forgive immediately, never made excuses for what they had done to me, just expressed genuine remorse and a commitment to doing better. About 2 months after the court hearing, my father asked if he could visit me in person, if we could have coffee and talk face-to-face. I agreed, feeling nervous but also curious about whether our phone relationship would translate to actual in-person interaction. We met at a coffee shop near my school on a Saturday afternoon, and I arrived early, ordering a hot chocolate and claiming a table in the back corner where we would have some privacy. When my father walked in, I almost didn't recognize him because he had lost weight and grown a beard and looked somehow both older and lighter, like he was carrying less invisible weight than before. He ordered a black coffee and sat down across from me, and for a long moment we just looked at each other, taking in the changes the past months had brought. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a wrapped gift, sliding it across the table with a small tentative smile. "I know your birthday is next week," he said, "and I wanted to give you this in person." I had honestly forgotten my own birthday was approaching, had been so caught up in adjusting to my new life that calendar dates had become meaningless. I unwrapped the gift carefully to find a silver chain with a simple pendant, the letter E in an elegant script. I put it on immediately, feeling the weight of the silver against my chest, and my father's face lit up with relief. "I wasn't sure what to get you," he admitted. "I mean, I'm still learning who you are, what you like, what matters to you." "I know," I said, "and it's okay. This is perfect." We talked for almost 3 hours that afternoon, longer than we had ever talked when I was living at home pretending to be Emma. He told me about his therapy sessions, about how he was working through his guilt about what happened, about how he was trying to support my mother while also accepting that she might never be ready to acknowledge me as her son. I told him about school, about my new friends, about my painting and the art club, about how strange and wonderful it felt to just be myself without constantly monitoring every word and gesture. Before we parted ways, he mentioned that my mother had started seeing a grief counselor who specialized in complicated loss and parental issues. "She's not ready to talk about you yet," he said carefully, choosing his words like he was walking through a minefield. "But she's trying to work through her feelings about everything that happened, about Emma's death, about you, about all of it." I nodded, trying not to get my hopes up but feeling that tiny spark of possibility that maybe someday she would come around. He mentioned that my mother kept the photo album with my baby pictures on her nightstand, that he had seen her looking at it sometimes late at night when she thought he was asleep. I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process the image of my mother looking at pictures of me as a baby. mourning the daughter who never really existed while refusing to acknowledge the son who did. We hugged goodbye, a quick, awkward embrace that felt like progress even though it was uncomfortable, and I watched him walk back to his car feeling emotionally exhausted, but also hopeful in a fragile, tentative way. The next few months settled into a comfortable routine that felt almost normal, or at least what I imagined normal teenage life was supposed to feel like. I went to school, did homework, hung out with Tyler and Sierra and some other friends I had made, attended art club meetings, went to therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma and identity issues. My father and I met for coffee every other week, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured by years of lies and abuse. He was making genuine effort, and I could see the change in him, could see how he was trying to understand and support me, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. Then one day in late spring, about 8 months after I had left home, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably my mother's, that precise, neat cursive I recognized from years of notes in my lunchbox and cards for various occasions. I stared at the envelope for a long time, my hands shaking slightly, before I could bring myself to open it. Inside was a birthday card, one of those generic happy birthday cards with balloons and confetti on the front. My birthday had actually been several months ago, back in winter, but the date didn't matter as much as what was written inside. The message was brief, just a few handwritten lines in my mother's careful script. I'm trying to understand. It's hard, but I miss you. Mom. She had addressed the card to Ethan, not Emma, had written my real name on the envelope and in her message, and that small acknowledgement felt monumental, like a crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean. It wasn't a declaration of love or unconditional acceptance, wasn't an apology for 13 years of abuse, wasn't everything I needed or wanted from her, but it was something. It was a start. It was more than she had been able to give me before. I showed the card to my therapist at our next session. Dr. Kim had been working with me for months on processing my complicated feelings about my parents, helping me understand that healing isn't linear, that people change at different speeds, that I was allowed to have boundaries and needs, even while acknowledging their pain. She reminded me that my mother's small step forward was still progress, even if it was frustratingly slow progress, even if it wasn't enough yet. "What do you want to do about this?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing, helping me explore my own feelings rather than telling me what I should think or do. I thought about it for several days, turning the question over in my mind during classes and while painting in art club and late at night when I couldn't sleep. Finally, I decided I wanted to respond, wanted to acknowledge her effort even if I wasn't ready for a full reconciliation. I bought a simple thank you card with a watercolor flower on the front and wrote a brief message. "Thank you for trying, for using my name, for reaching out. It means a lot to me." I signed it Ethan in my own messy handwriting, sealed the envelope, and mailed it before I could second-guess myself. I didn't expect a response and didn't receive one for several weeks, but my father mentioned during one of our coffee meetings that my mother had put my card on the refrigerator, that it was the first time in months he had seen her smile, that she had read it multiple times and traced my signature with her finger like she was trying to memorize the shape of my name. These tiny pieces of information felt like breadcrumbs leading towards some distant possibility of reconciliation, and I tried not to read too much into them while also feeling cautiously hopeful about what they might mean. Summer arrived, bringing with it the heat and humidity that made my small apartment feel like an oven, and with summer came my 1-year anniversary of independence. Hope Harbor had a tradition of celebrating these milestones, marking the moment when teens had successfully survived a year on their own, a year of growth and change and self-discovery. Jordan and some of the other residents decorated our apartment with streamers and balloons. Dana brought cupcakes from my favorite bakery. Tyler and Sierra showed up with homemade cards and small gifts. Marcus and his parents came too, bringing flowers and expressing how proud they were of how far I had come. And my father arrived with a gift bag containing professional quality art supplies that must have cost more than I wanted to think about. As I looked around at all these people who had shown up to celebrate me, who accepted me exactly as I was without conditions or expectations, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude and something that felt almost like joy. A year ago, I had been trapped in a life that wasn't mine, suffocating under the weight of being someone else, desperate and hopeless and alone. Now I was surrounded by people who saw the real me, who supported me, who celebrated my existence rather than trying to reshape it into something more convenient for them. The only shadow on the celebration was my mother's absence, the empty space where she should have been, and I couldn't help wondering if she would ever be able to fill that space. But then, just as we were about to cut the cake Dana had brought, there was a knock at the door. Jordan went to answer it and came back looking confused and slightly concerned. "Ethan, there's someone here for you," they said, and something in their tone made my stomach clench with anxiety. I walked to the door and found my mother standing in the hallway, looking small and nervous and uncertain, holding a gift bag with tissue paper sticking out the top. She looked thinner than I remembered, more fragile somehow, and there were new lines around her eyes and mouth that made her look older and sadder. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father told me about the party, and I hoped it would be okay if I came." I was too shocked to speak, too stunned by her presence to form coherent words, so I just nodded and stepped aside to let her enter. The room fell silent as she walked in, everyone recognizing the weight of this moment, the significance of her appearance. My father looked as surprised as I felt, clearly not having known she was planning to come, and I saw hope flash across his face. My mother walked directly to me, not acknowledging anyone else in the room, and handed me the gift bag with trembling hands. "It's not much," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Just something I thought you might like, something I should have given you a long time ago." Inside the bag was a silver picture frame, simple and elegant, containing a photo I had never seen before. It was me as a baby, maybe 6 or 7 months old, wearing a blue onesie with trucks on it and sitting in my mother's lap. We were both looking at something off camera and laughing, genuine joy captured in that frozen moment, and on the back of the frame my mother had written in her careful handwriting, "Ethan, 7 months old." I looked up at her, tears filling my eyes before I could stop them, and saw that she was crying too. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking on the words. "This means everything to me." She nodded, reaching out like she wanted to touch my face, but stopping herself, respecting my boundaries even as she struggled with her own emotions. "I'm sorry it took me so long," she said, her voice cracking and breaking. "I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to let go of Emma and accept you, didn't know how to grieve one child while celebrating another." Part of me wanted to hug her immediately, wanted to forgive everything and have my mother back in my life, but 13 years of hurt and betrayal couldn't be erased by one moment of acknowledgement. I asked if she wanted some cake, keeping my voice neutral, trying to give us both time to adjust to this unexpected situation. She stayed for about an hour, awkward and tense, but making visible effort to be present, to be part of this celebration. She used my correct name and pronouns, asked about school and my art, complimented the apartment, and thanked Jordan for being a good roommate to me. Small gestures, simple words, but loaded with meaning after so many months of silence and rejection. Before she left, she pulled me aside into the hallway, away from the others, and I could see how much courage it was taking her to have this conversation. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy for me," she said, her hands twisting together nervously. "I'm still processing everything, still working through my grief and my mistakes, still trying to understand how to be your mother instead of Emma's mother. But I miss you so much it physically hurts, and I want to try. I want to learn how to have a relationship with my son even though it scares me." "That's all I'm asking," I told her, my own voice thick with emotion. "Just try. Just see me for who I am instead of who you wanted me to be." "Maybe we could have lunch sometime," she suggested tentatively. "Just the two of us, just to talk and start rebuilding whatever relationship we can have." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it despite my reservations and fears. The lunch with my mother happened the following week. Neutral territory at a quiet restaurant neither of us had been to before. We sat across from each other in a booth by the window, and the conversation was stilted and uncomfortable at first, both of us sticking to safe topics like the weather and my summer break and her garden. But gradually, slowly, we started talking about more important things, edging toward the painful truths that needed to be acknowledged between us. "I've been seeing Dr. Park, a trauma therapist who specializes in grief and complicated loss," she told me, her fingers tracing patterns on her water glass. "She's helping me understand that I've been projecting my grief about Emma, about the baby I lost, onto you in ways that were incredibly unfair and harmful. I know it wasn't right, and I'm trying to do better." "No, I agreed quietly. It wasn't fair or right, and it hurt me in ways I'm still trying to understand and heal from. But I'm glad you're getting help. Glad you're working on yourself. She reached across the table tentatively and touched my hand briefly, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since that day in the hallway months ago. I can't promise I'll always get it right, she said. I'm going to make mistakes and say the wrong things and struggle with this because it goes against 13 years of seeing you one way. But I want to know my son, want to have a relationship with Ethan, even though I'm terrified of messing it up again. That conversation was the beginning of something new and fragile between us, a relationship we were building from scratch rather than trying to repair what had been broken beyond fixing. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, and there were many difficult moments in the months that followed. My mother still occasionally slipped up and called me Emma, still got visibly uncomfortable when I wore certain clothes or talked about typical guy things, still had moments where I could see her grieving for the daughter who never existed. But she was trying, genuinely trying, and that effort meant more to me than I could put into words. By the time I started my senior year of high school, things had settled into what felt like a new normal, different from before but stable in its own way. I still lived at Hope Harbor Housing, but spent more time with my parents, having dinner with them once a week and talking to both of them regularly on the phone. My father and I had rebuilt our relationship into something stronger than it had been before, because it was based on honesty and acceptance, rather than lies and manipulation. My mother and I were creating a relationship from scratch, learning each other as if we were strangers meeting for the first time, which in many ways we were. I didn't know what the future held, couldn't predict how my relationship with my parents would evolve over time, couldn't guarantee that everything would work out perfectly. But I had learned that I was strong enough to stand up for myself, brave enough to claim my own identity even when everyone around me tried to define me differently, resilient enough to build a life that felt authentic and true. I started thinking seriously about college and career plans, considering programs in art therapy because I wanted to help other kids who had struggled with identity issues and family rejection, wanted to use my experience to make a difference for others walking similar paths. I still had moments of doubt and fear, still had days when the weight of everything that had happened threatened to crush me, still had nightmares about being forced back into dresses and being called Emma and losing everything I had fought so hard to gain. But I also had good days, great days even, days when I felt completely comfortable in my own skin, days when I looked in the mirror and genuinely liked the person looking back at me. I had that photo album my father had given me, filled with pictures of me as a baby before my parents started pretending I was Emma, and now it sat next to the framed photo my mother had given me, together telling the story of Ethan who got lost for a while but finally found his way home to himself.